Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted greater creativity in your life, then do we have the Creative Curve show for you. Today I'll be talking with Allen Gannett, founder and CEO of TrackMaven, we're here to please, and the author of a brilliant new must-read on creativity and success, The Creative Curve. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about how to develop the right idea at the right time. That plus we'll talk about Elmo impressions, believing in scrambled eggs, what we can all learn from Grumpy Cat, popes and brothels, the IQ of termites, lentils in South Dakota, Jim the Agent Sherpa, a corgi named Maven, and what in the world dill pickle ice cream has to do with anything. So welcome to the show, Allen. Are you ready to shine?
I'm ready to shine. Let's do it.
Woohoo! So before we dive right into things, I was going to ask about patterns, but first off, what does Elmo impressions or impersonations have to do with anything?
So I tell the story in the book of how I've always been addicted to finding patterns and reverse engineering stuff. And I think it comes from being an only child and just having a little bit too much time on my hands. My parents they were divorced and working all the time. And when I was 18, I had this thing where I was like, I'd spend my sort of childhood, decoding video games and trying to figure out how to beat these things. And I was like, I wonder how hard it is to get on a game show. And so I applied for every game show on the planet, and Wheel of Fortune called me into audition. I never watched the show before. And so I decided to watch lots and lots of episodes, but only the first part to see what the contestants were like when they introduced themselves. And I realized that all they did was they enunciated well, and they were kind of goofy. And I was like, I can do that. And so I had a whole bunch of espresso. I got up and I was like, hi, I am Allen from New Jersey. And then I did an Elmo impression, which I'm scared to recreate.
But you are going to do right now, just for the fun of it.
Elmo loves Inspired Nation. It's really not that great anymore. The falsetto's gone. And then I got cast. And then I was on Wheel of Fortune, and I did not study the puzzles enough, and so I lost to Joan from Alexandria, Virginia, who won $60,000. And I'm not scorned about this or anything. It's totally fine. It's not. I got bankrupt twice. It was really sad.
So then, if we go back in time, your time spending video games, this is rare to say, was actually time well spent.
Yeah, so I basically, ever since I was maybe even 5 or 6, was always creating different games and ways to occupy myself. My mom got laid off when I was 12, and she went back to school, so then she was working even more. And I, for example, remember as a little kid, I created this game, which is why I turned into a fat child, which was, instead of toy soldiers, it was popcorn versus M&Ms. And anytime they died in combat, I ate them. Very fun, very good way to become a chubby 5-year-old. And so I was always finding ways to entertain myself. And I think that sort of turned into this habit of being really interested in how the patterns of things work, whether it's the AI of a video game or different things. And eventually that's turned into, I run a company now called TrackMaven, which we professionally help big brands find patterns in their data.
So what you needed to do was you needed as a 5-year-old to have interviewed the people at Ben & Jerry's to find out if you're going to be the popcorn and M&M guru that you need to ride a bike.
You definitely read the book. I'm impressed. This is good.
It's a good sign. All right. So let's talk about this. You said you intentionally follow the world's most vaunted creative geniuses to understand and execute your own great ideas. What's that mean?
So the book is split up into 2 halves. So the first half of the book is talking about the history and science of creativity and debunking this idea of the inspiration theory of creativity, that creativity is this magical, wonderful thing that some people have and the rest of us normies don't. And the second half of the book is I interviewed 25 living creative geniuses. So these are people like Michelin star chefs, like Pasek and Paul, the songwriting duo behind La La Land, Dear Evan Hansen, and The Greatest Showman. I interviewed Alexis Ohanian from Reddit. I interviewed the Ben & Jerry's flavor development team, Brenda Chapman, the first woman to win the Oscar for Best Animated Film. And from these interviews, I found that there was these 4 patterns of things they all did to actually enhance their creativity. And I actually explain in the book what those patterns were and the science of why they work. So it's meant to not just be one of these books of like, here's some interesting stories, but it's meant to be very actionable.
Awesome. So I want to dive into all of these components. Before I do that, what does scrambled eggs have to do with anything and believing in them?
So there's this famous story about creativity of Paul McCartney woke up one day and he had a dream where he actually dreamed the melody for Yesterday, which is the most recorded song in history. And he was so worried about this. He had this epiphany, this really famous flash of genius. He was so worried that maybe he had accidentally plagiarized something that he went around for weeks to his friends and asked them, he's like, have you heard this before? And they were like, Paul, no, it's original. And he's like, are you sure? And he only had the melody. And so his placeholder lyrics, he used, I can sing them for you if you'd like.
Oh, go for it.
Okay. He used, because someone was eating scrambled eggs when he was playing it for them. And he decided to use scrambled eggs. Oh, my baby, how I love your eggs. Little I believe in scrambled eggs. I know. Raucous applause. Raucous applause. And so scrambled eggs were the temporary lyrics for the song Yesterday, which is a really great example of a story where we have this myth, this idea that yesterday just came to him. And the reality is like 6 notes came to him, and he spent 20 months actually finishing that song. It was an incredible amount of hard work. He became obsessed with it. While they were filming the movie Help, he was off and actually practicing it and trying to get it right. And it took a really, really long time for him to nail it. And so it's a good example of how on the surface, we have this mythology around the song Yesterday as being this, instant flash, and then it became this big hit. And the reality is this was like a long, grueling process. And that's the common pattern you see. These creativity myths are just that, they're myths.
Going along the line of myths, and from what I understand, he drove everybody insane trying to get that song out.
They got sick of him.
So let's talk about, when we talk about myths, let's talk about the IQ of termites.
Yes. So one of the things I talk about in the book is when you actually look at the science around creativity, what the science shows us is that IQ and creativity are actually not that related. And there's a few different studies that have looked at this. One of the ones I think is most interesting is Louis Terman, who Americanized the IQ test. He brought it over from France. He was a professor at Stanford, so he called it the Stanford-Binet IQ test. Makes sense. And he, at the time, geniuses were viewed skeptically. Because of all the 1800s, there was all this mad genius literature that became a big phenomenon. So geniuses reviewed like, why are they so good at that one thing? They must be bad at everything else. And so he wanted to prove this point that geniuses were actually normal. And so what he did is he tested thousands of school-age children to find 2,000 kids who had genius-level IQs. Then he started sending them surveys every 5 years to see how they were doing. And he called these kids his termites, which is terrifying, and very bad branding. He was not a marketer. And then his proteges, after Louis Terman died, kept sending out these surveys. And what was amazing was that these surveys showed that, these kids were normal when it came to like depression and divorce and suicide, but they're actually also normal when it came to success. Like there were retail clerks and there were mechanics. In fact, there were no Nobel Prize winners. There was no household names. In fact, the only 2 kids who were tested who won a Nobel Prize were 2 kids who didn't make the genius cutoff. And so what you see when you actually look at the science around IQ and the science around creativity, you actually see a lot of academic consensus that creativity is a learnable, nurturable skill. But that is so far from the opposite of what we talk about when we talk about creativity in our culture.
Quick pop quiz. How many different uses can you think of for a yo-yo?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
You can use a yo-yo probably to smash a window.
Yep.
You could use a yo-yo to, I don't know what else.
Walk a dog.
Walk the dog. That's true. Yo-yo moves. Those count.
So, all right, then what is, putting you on the spot, I should be asking you about hair dryers, but what's divergent thinking then?
So divergent thinking is basically scientists have these questions that they ask people as a way to measure creativity and creative potential. So they'll ask questions like, what are some uses of a yo-yo? I clearly failed. Or like, what are some uncommon uses of a hair dryer? And based on the number of answers you have and the quality of answers, that's how they can actually assess people's creativity. And divergent thinking tests are actually really fascinating. I mean, there's been these studies that show that kids in kindergarten have the creative potential of geniuses at 86% of kindergartners are at that level. By the time they're in high school, it's like 15% or something. And so like, it's actually a really powerful tool for seeing how creativity is much more of a structural and social phenomenon than we think. And I think part of the issue is that your creativity happens in our brain, and we're really bad as a society of realizing how much our brain can change. Like, I think you would agree, like if we started going to the gym, not saying that you don't, but if we start going to the gym and lifting heavy stuff and eating lots of protein, we would get more muscle. But for some reason, people think their brain is this like static thing, when in fact there's all this science around neurogenesis and brain neuroplasticity and the idea that our brain adapts to the task at hand. There's a study that looked at the brains of cab drivers in an MRI machine and
London
found
cabbies, yes.
London cabbies, the longer they were cab drivers, the larger the part of their brain tied to visual, spatial, and navigational skills was. Their brain actually changed because of the task they were doing. It became more talented at a specific thing. And so I think we're really bad at realizing that as humans, we can get better at things, even cognitive things.
Woohoo!
This is good news.
This is great news, and this is news that every time you and I have both heard, well, I'm not good at that. Well, I'm not good at this. No, I'm not good at math. No, I'm not good at marketing. Whatever it is, what you're saying is, and what's so true, is we can change that.
100%. And it's amazing because the people who spend their time studying talent development, for example, there's a lot of consensus. I know you've had Anders Ericsson on the show, but there's a lot of consensus that like the idea of natural born talent is at best overblown and probably a myth. I mean, usually when you actually go back and look at these stories of child prodigies, you find a story like this, like the kid was 5, he started drawing randomly, the parent was loving and very complimentary, and maybe unlike my mother, and so they said, oh, this is a great drawing, and all the kid was like, oh, this is great, I should draw more. And so he kept drawing, and eventually it actually became good, and he got more feedback, and by the time he was 11, he'd been drawing for 6 years when the other kids were just starting their first art class in school. And so the idea of sort of natural born talent is probably overblown, and decent chance that it's completely a myth.
Well, and what, going back to something earlier when we're talking about kids in kindergarten versus high school, part of it is that whole reward, because usually we're taught to play it safe, and to play it safe means to play it by rote, to memorize, and to stop being creative and taking a risk. And I think this gets into what you call creativity and genius as a social phenomena.
100%. I mean, one of the things you see right now with young people is an amazing amount of young people going to top tier schools who want to be consultants, lawyers, investment bankers. I think right now we're in a place where, especially in Western culture, we've put money and wealth on such a pedestal that people feel that's so important that they must optimize their life around making sure they make money. And so they lower their risk to a point where they're like, well, at least I'm going to make serious 6 figures, and I have a strong downside. And it's kind of ironic because if you think about any of those roles, for example, like an iBanker or a lawyer, they're typically working for people who are creative. Like an iBanker selling companies started by entrepreneurs who are creative. And so you see this whole generation of hardworking people who are going into these sort of boring, low-risk jobs because they're so obsessed about wealth. And ironically, it's probably actually the worst way to make money.
I think I've mutated it a couple times from probably a Steve Jobs quote, which is A students work for the B students work for the C students, and the C, D, and F students, those are the creative ones that everybody works for.
Yes. No, it's totally true. It's amazing. I mean, I remember back in high school, the obsession that people had with getting into a school that they could get a finance degree in. And now, as an entrepreneur, you have, iBanks pitching you for their business. And you realize that, oh my God, their job is to make spreadsheets and send emails and PowerPoint decks. Like, this is horrible. Why were the kids in my high school so obsessed with that?
And it really comes down to, and this is part of what the show is to help free people up, is to help them to live their greatest lives, is when you're not going down whatever is your creative path, your inner flame isn't really lit. And so you may have quantity in that you may have dollars rolling in, but you don't necessarily have quality in your hours and in your life.
Oh, and we see this all the time. We think about the amount of wealthy people who commit suicide or depressed. I mean, all this stuff. I mean, if you talk to very rich people, they'll tell you that the money doesn't buy them happiness. It buys them comfort, which at times makes them happy. But there's lots of ways to be comfortable. And you find that, it's kind of funny because I think, a lot of rich people become rich and they realize this didn't make me happy. And they start telling everyone about how money doesn't buy happiness, and no one believes them because, like, yeah, you can say it because you're rich, but I think those are probably things worth listening to, because I think the Bill Gates of the world are serious when they say, hey, even with billions of dollars, like, happiness is not coming from that. It's coming from the world around you and the people you surround yourself with and the impact you have.
Woohoo! So, on that note, let's talk about familiarity and the creative curve. What in the world is this?
Oh, this is so interesting. So, one of the things that people grapple with creativity is like, well, how do you create things that people actually like?
Yeah.
And it seems so nebulous, like what becomes a trend, what becomes a hit. But scientists have actually done a lot of really amazing research on consumer preference and taste. And basically comes down to this. It turns out that we have two evolutionary urges that seem like a contradiction, but actually make a lot of sense. So one urge is that as people, our brain is constantly assessing the familiarity of things. Because if something's unfamiliar, like if you were a cave dweller and you saw a cave you've never been in before, you'd be like, danger. That might not be good. I might die if I go in there. I should go to a cave I've slept in before. Okay. And then similarly, we also have this other urge, which seemingly is a contradiction. We also seek out things that are novel. And the reason why is because novelty represents potential new sources of rewards. Like if you saw a berry that you've never seen before, but kind of looks like a weird strawberry, you might go, oh, this is a new source of dinner. This is amazing. I'm going to eat this strawberry. And these things seemingly are in contradiction, right? Seeking novelty and seeking familiarity. But what it is, that's actually our brain's really elegant way of balancing risk and reward. We want things that are not too familiar, and we want things that are not too novel. We're scared of things that are too unfamiliar, and we're scared of things that are radically novel. And so it turns out that the ideas that take hold in our culture are ideas that are a blend of the familiar and the new. Think about the first Star Wars. It was literally a Western in space. Right now, there's this whole trend around sushi burritos that's blowing up. That's literally sushi in a burrito form. And like we like these ideas that are a twist, right? There's something that feels safe, but it's new enough to be interesting. And the result is that there's this upside down U-shaped curve relationship between exposure and preference. So when we first see something, we don't like it. Then the more we're exposed to it, the more we like it, till it reaches a certain point where we start getting bored. And then the more we see it, the less we like it. And so scientists call this the inverted U-shaped relationship between familiarity and preference. And I rebranded it the creative curve because I'm a marketer and sounds much better.
And what it means is when you binge on something, anything, you enjoy it up till a certain point, and then you want to get as far away from it as you possibly can.
Think about music, and they've actually done studies with this, like this phenomenon you have where you're like, oh, I really want to hear that new song, but then like a few months later, you're like, oh, I don't want to hear that new Bruno Mars song again. They've actually done this in research settings, and they find there's this U-shaped relationship. Like the first time you hear that new Bruno Mars song, you're like, it's okay. And then the second time, you're like, yeah, this is great. And the 10th time, you're like, I love this, but maybe there can be something else. And pretty soon you hate it, right? And so that U-shaped relationship is really, really important when you're creative, because your job is to create something that's not too new and not too familiar.
Well, it's interesting. You got me thinking about the Beatles and the sitar, and now I'm combining that with the Inspire Nation show. How do we keep something that's new and exciting for people, but not too new or too exciting, or something that doesn't become so stale that people then fall off the backside of the curve?
100%. And this is an example I talk about in the book with a couple things. I want to talk about the Facebook. When they first started, there was Facebook in the Campus Network. Campus Network started a month earlier at Columbia, also went viral on campus, and they both tried to launch nationally. And obviously, you've never heard of Campus Network before than the book. And the reason why is that Campus Network actually had too many features. A lot of the features that Facebook would later have, Campus Network had from the start. And you might say, oh, it's good to be advanced. But actually, it was too advanced. It was too novel. It was too unfamiliar. And so people didn't like it. And then what you find is the people who are really good at creativity are really good at always knowing where an idea would fall on this relationship between familiarity and preference. So like the Beatles, for example, introduced the sitar to mainstream pop music. And then in the early 60s, there was this whole phase in pop music where like everyone was using the sitar. Like Elvis Presley was using it, the Mamas and the Papas. And by that time, the Beatles were already moving away and they were using other stuff. And so before that became stale, they were introducing new concepts. And so the Beatles are a great example. They were sort of this chameleon that was always slowly shifting their sound and how they wrote their music so that it never became too stale for their audience, but they also didn't make big leaps and bounds. It was these gradual transitions that allowed them to stay relevant.
I'm trying to figure out how to mate the Inspire Nation show with a sushi burrito. So tell us, what are the 4 laws? Let's start with the 4 laws of the creative curve. Maybe let's start with law number 1. This has to do with the sushi burrito, I guess. The law of consumption.
So in the book, I outlined these 4 things I found from these creative geniuses. The first one, and this is the one I think surprises people the most, is that I found that all these creative geniuses were like crazy active consumers. Mm-hmm. There's that annoying social media meme you've probably seen that's like, it's just like, oh, it's like 90% of people consume, 9% of people engage, 1% create, #hustle. And it's terrible because 1, it's annoying, and 2, it's actually wrong because it actually turns out that because familiarity is such an important part of creativity, mm-hmm. the best creators are actually also big consumers. And it's not wide consumption. Like, it's not like they're learning a little about a lot like you would on Twitter, but they actually go very, 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 very deep on one topic. I think there's this myth that, to be creative, you have to know all these things about all these things. But really, the people who are actually really good have lots and lots of specialized knowledge. Lots of specialized knowledge. And so that was one that enables them to learn the familiar. The second law is imitation. Mm-hmm. So, we think of creativity again as this thing around, innovation is a word we use, new ideas. But as I talked about, it's actually the blend of the familiar and the novel. So since part of your goal is to create the familiar, imitation is actually a really important part of how creatives learn how to be great. So it's not just that they consume, but they actually consume in this way that's sort of, it's like I call it interactive, mm-hmm. where they're almost turning the content they consume into like a Mad Lib. So they'll like read a novel and they'll like outline how it actually flows. Kurt Vonnegut, in his master's thesis, actually mapped out the story arcs of all these famous novels and identified these 4 patterns of great stories. And that's part of how he learned storytelling, right? It was understanding like what is the sort of Mad Libification of a novel, so then you can fill in your own novel twist. It's a lot of the use of the word novel. And so since it's about this relationship between familiarity and novelty, imitating the structure of past successful works is this huge shortcut to actually standing on the shoulders of giants. Do you want me to go to law 3? I can talk forever about this stuff.
So, I want to talk about the 20% principle because I was thinking about it again. I love your book. I said it's a must read. And by that, I mean, I'm going to read it again and again and again. Our show has gone viral and taken off. We're everywhere. However, there's a lot that we can learn. And I have actually stayed away from watching other people's shows and learning about what they're doing. And what I'm hearing you suggest is sort of like the Beatles, who probably weren't listening to the Beach Boys every day. You know what's out there, and then you learn and you can understand, again, going back to social phenomena, where other people are at, where the market's at.
100%. Because basically, so in the book, I talk about how these creatives usually had some initial period of intense consumption, mm-hmm. but they typically actually spend going forward, they still spend about 20% of their day consuming content. And that's about 3 to 4 hours of time. I talk about 20% of their waking hours. And the reason why this is so important is because you constantly have to be shifting like the Beatles did, right? And so you constantly have to be seeing what's that new style. And so I think in sort of our world, I think Gary Vaynerchuk does a great job of this, where he's constantly shifting new platforms as they come out. Like now he's doing all this voice stuff and he's constantly doing that. And so he's, he used to be very YouTube oriented. Now he's very Instagram oriented. And I think the danger is if you don't consume, it's very easy to fall in your own silo. And so you don't even realize it by the time your format, your style, your genre, whatever it is, has past due. So I think staying an active consumer is very important. So we got you more homework now.
I like it. And so I've got to ask then, can you tell us about Gary and Instagram?
I don't know too much about Gary and Instagram other than the fact that he's was early on to it. Mm-hmm. And he was early on to it, very active, did a lot of it himself. You could see when he writes about it, he thinks a lot about the best practices. But now he's moving on to doing a lot more voice stuff, and that's his big thing. He has a voice conference, and I don't agree with a lot of the things he says, but I do think it's really fascinating to watch his career, where he's been very, very good at understanding where certain trends are, when to get off them. I mean, when Facebook video was blowing up, he was all over Facebook video. Right now, he's all over Instagram. He's getting all over voice. He's no longer as active on YouTube. And so that's just a great example of someone who is staying very culturally relevant, but being very aware of what's going on. And you see when he talks about how he's this very active social media user. Like he's not just hanging out. And I interviewed for the book a bunch of YouTube stars. So I interviewed Casey Neistat and Connor Franta. And both of them talk about how they're just like, they love YouTube. They love YouTube videos. Like they would start by watching all these videos and they're active, and that's a big part of it. And so, yeah, I really think consumption is one of these things that's actually accessible to a lot of us. We just don't do it enough.
Thank you. So on that note, what I'm hearing here in the background is also an understanding of a formula. There's a formula here, just like there's a formula for music. And in fact, we may get into that. What's the Cinderella formula?
Oh, yeah. So basically, Kurt Vonnegut found that there's these different arcs for stories. Mm-hmm. And so in the book, I got permission from the Vonnegut estate to reprint them. And one of the arcs of stories is basically Cinderella's story. It's like she, starts poor. She has this moment where she thinks everything's better. Then it gets worse again, but then it becomes really happy. And that story arc, he actually maps it out. And he later did this in the 80s as part of a lecture. And the video of it you can find on YouTube. It's really cool and went viral. And he talks about how that story arc is reused over and over again in all sorts of stories. And once you understand these story arcs, actually writing a story becomes much easier. You understand like how to pin a story together. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about romance writers. Mm-hmm. I think romance writers are such a great example where, we sometimes say they're formulaic in like a bad way. But I think mostly a lot of times we criticize things as formulaic that we just don't like. Like, people call pop music today, they're like, oh, it's pop music. But the Beatles were pop music in the 60s. Like, this is just whatever is contemporary. We tend not, if we don't like it, we're like, oh, it's pop. But romance is such a great example of like, there's these very clear pieces of what goes into a romance novel that makes it appealing, right? There's this thing called the black moment where all hope is lost. It's usually near the end, and the end of the book is tying it up and resolving it. That ends with a happily ever after. And these things, which I would say are formulas, and I don't think formula is a bad word, these things are what allows a piece of content to be familiar. When you are going to an action movie or going to a Marvel movie, there's going to be certain elements there. And there's that familiarity that makes it comfortable, that makes it feel safe. So then you can enjoy the novelty of it.
Woohoo! So let's go from there and let's talk about Law 3, which is, I believe, arguably the most important law and the law that Jessica and I running the show get to work on the most, because you say building the right type of community might be the most crucial part of the creative process.
So this is crazy to me. So I mean, there's this notion of like the solo genius. Mm-hmm. And it's just so unhealthy for our debate about this stuff, because the reality is that creativity is this like amazingly communal and social phenomenon. I mean, one, you need people to actually see your work to actually allow it to be deemed creative, right? So because there is literally the aspect of like creativity is subjective. So you need people to agree that something's creative. Two is that the idea that like Steve Jobs is like building Apple by himself is just comically untrue. I mean, he needed Steve Wozniak in the beginning. Elon Musk has some of the world's best rocket scientists working for him. Taylor Swift has songwriters, engineers, producers, all these people. I mean, writing a book, you experience this where like it's only my name on the cover, but you have editor, copy editor, proofreader, research assistants, agent, feedback readers. You have all these people who come together to actually make a work happen. So I think it's sort of like, think about like a band, and how there's like a front man who usually gets, probably an oversized amount of attention. Creative work generally is like that, where like the front man of any creative product gets this overwhelming amount of attention, but actually you need the rhythm guitarist and the lead guitarist and the drummer. You need all those pieces to actually make it hum. And so the communal aspects of creativity are so important. And it's also interesting because one of the things I found that I was really surprised by is that the really successful creatives, like the people, like I interviewed David Rubenstein, who's a billionaire, and he is like obsessed with like reverse mentorship, like getting and learning insights from younger people who are earlier in their career, because he knows that it's not just about familiarity, it's also about novelty. So he needs those novel ideas to stay fresh, to stay relevant, and he needs people for that. And so these really, really successful people, I don't mean successful people, I mean like really successful people, you find always have people hovering around them. Like Andy Warhol famously with The Factory, which was his studio space in New York, he always had people, other artists around him, and he was constantly just ingesting new ideas, and that's how he stayed relevant.
Thank you. And since we're speaking about reverse mentors, we should also talk about mentorship and being, what would be the best word for it? Elbowing your way into mentorship.
So one of the things I found about these creatives is that, we use the word mentor, and it actually means, I think, two different things. There's two roles that mentors play for us, and they can be actually separate people. One is a teacher, someone who teaches us the ways of certain crafts, and you need that. And the other is a promoter, someone who's going to lend you their credibility, their reputation. You see this with bands, right? When they have a tour, they have opening acts, for example, or academics will let the junior researcher put their name on the paper as a way of sort of helping build their resume. You see this in all these different industries. And what's so interesting about this is that these great creatives, most of them don't come from super connected families, but what they do is they weren't willing to take no. I mean, Jk Rowling famously, I interviewed her first agent. Yeah. She just sent letter after letter after letter cold to these agents until one signed her. I interviewed this guy, D.A. Wallach, who got signed to Pharrell's record label while he was in Harvard. Yeah. And what he did is he started networking. He found that River Cuomo from Weezer was, taking classes at Harvard that semester. He found his email in the student directory, emailed him, got lunch with him, and started networking in the music industry. And obviously that's Harvard. It's sort of a different world and space. But still, that same idea, especially with the internet, where with a few free tools, you can find almost anyone's email address. I mean, that's really an important part of it is how do you get connected to those people who can teach you, but they can also actually lend you their reputation. That's so important to the entire process.
Awesome. So since we were talking about this off air, I have to ask right now, David Rubenstein and the Aspen Ideas Festival.
So I was at the Aspen Ideas Festival, I don't know, was it 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago? And it was so funny because I had set up this interview with David Rubenstein, and he was we're getting tea. And we're getting tea, and he's the most casual, accessible guy. This is a guy who's on the board of the Kennedy Center and the Smithsonian. I think he's the chair of both of them right now. Just crazy. And it was so interesting to watch. All these people came by and recognized him. They said hi. He was he always was checking in with people, asking how they were. He started interrogating me about what I did for work and what he could learn from me. And I was oh my God, this guy's one of the most famous people in finance. And it was just this great example of this guy who's part of why he's remained on the top of his game is that he's not afraid of continuing to learn. And he's very curious. You see this now. He actually has a TV show where he interviews people on Bloomberg. It's really good, the David Rubenstein show. And so you see this trend, and it's fascinating. And he's a great example of someone who engages in reverse mentorship all the time.
Woohoo! On that note, what's clustering?
Oh, so one of the things I talk about in the book is that since there's this whole communal aspect around creativity, there's also a really strong effect that sociologists have found where creatives cluster into specific geographical areas. So LA is obviously entertainment, New York is fashion, art, some entertainment, San Francisco is technology. And the thing is that since there's so much of a social phenomenon to creativity, these are actually really important. It's actually really, really hard to be creatively successful if you're not in those areas because no one's going to be able to randomly meet you at a coffee shop or bump into you and stay top of mind. And, I've experienced this as an entrepreneur where I'm in Washington, D.C., not the biggest tech hub, and I do marketing technology. And so I constantly have to go to New York. Because if I'm not there, even if I could do a phone call or a Skype session, there's something different. There's something different about meeting someone in person, about building a relationship. And so if you want to be a true creative achiever, you either have to move to one of these cities or you better go there a darn lot. And I mean a lot.
Oh boy, warm up that jet. I'm trying to circumvent it. I'm just outside Aspen so I can get in, meet with a lot of creatives, and get out and up into the hills.
No worries. You'll survive.
Woohoo! All right, let's talk about Law for Iterations and, oh my God, dill pickle ice cream.
So for the book, I went and spent a day with the flavor team at Ben & Jerry's, which, by the way, as someone who's not that tolerant of milk, was like a whole experience. And by the way, somehow all the flavor R&D team, they're all skinny, which I was like, there's some conspiracy here. But what's so interesting is really this hit home for me, this differentiation between quality of something and the market viability of something. And a great example of this was at one point we were talking and they sort of had this big smirk on their face and they're like, do you want to try dill pickle sorbet? And I was like, what? And they're like, dill pickle sorbet. And I was like, excuse me? And by the time I said me, they had gone to the fridge and grabbed it and they scooped some for me. And dude, dill pickle sorbet is so good. Like shockingly good. Like just like what is going on good. And it's one of those things where they know, like they've looked at it and just it's not going to be commercially successful, at least not right now. And so even though it tastes great, like those two things, technical skill and technical proficiency and commercial viability and getting that right idea at the right time, those are actually distinct things. And Ben & Jerry's is so fascinating because they're a great example of a very iterative process. So, there's the whole idea that creatives are like, they're working in this very linear fashion until they hit done. But the reality is, like Ben & Jerry's, first they spend a year literally almost consuming trends about food. They go to different cities and try out new restaurants. They taste all the food trends.
Nice job.
There you go. Good puns. And then they come up with a list of 200 flavor profiles, and they literally send out an email survey to their customers asking, one, how likely are you to buy this flavor? And two, how unique is it? Which is basically how familiar is it? And how novel is it? And from that, they found that the ideas that do the best for them are when they combine ideas that are commercially viable with uniqueness, so that it's not that they become this stale, boring brand, but they're constantly innovating, constantly doing new things. And so using data, even very lo-fi data, helps them refine their innovation process and make a lot less mistakes. And then they actually once they do that, then they start actually creating samples. Then they do more testing, and they test the packaging, and they test the names. And these are all things you could do for like less than $100 online these days. Like you can use Google Survey and all this stuff. And so one of the things you find with these great creatives is that the process is way more iterative than you think, and it's way more feedback oriented than you think, because they understand that creativity is this social contract between you and the audience where you're creating something for them. So the result is that they want that audience feedback early and often.
I never thought about it in this terms, but they're gaming marketing.
They're gaming marketing. They're trying to, before they actually have to release it, they're trying to get those results. And you see this in lots of places now. You see this with Kickstarter, right? The idea of pre-funding. It's a really good example of how to make creativity much more efficient, because now instead of actually creating your product, if your Kickstarter fails, I guess people weren't actually that interested in this.
That makes sense. And films, and you talk about one is it Fatal Attraction?
Yeah, Fatal Attraction is a great example where the film industry is very feedback, iteration, and data obsessed. So like they do these test screenings of movies, and like Fatal Attraction, which won all these Academy Awards, made all this money at the box office. Fatal Attraction had a completely different ending when it was done. And when they did test screenings, they found the ending, like no one liked the ending. And so they completely reshot the ending to be what it is today and what's it known for, which is this like psychodrama thriller ending. That was not the original artistic or creative vision, but we would definitely say that Fatal Attraction was a creative success. And so that's where I think sometimes we get confused. You have to take yourself out of the creativity equation if you want to create things that truly are going to resonate for the audience, because it's not just about you, it's about the audience.
What can we learn from Jk Rowling?
Oh, so I end the book with, I profiled sort of Jk Rowling, and I interviewed her first publisher and her first agent. And it was so interesting because, she's a great example of all of the different laws of creativity. As a kid, she was an avid reader. She would close her bedroom door to get away from her parents fighting. She would read. In college, she had library fines. She had so many books out. She then was highly iterative. I mean, she, for example, the first book took her 5 years to write, right? So it just takes a massive amount of time, iterations. She relied on all these people around her. I mean, she was very focused on getting an agent. She had a great marketing team. She had people in place to help her ideas go from point A to point B. And so, she's just this great example of someone who I think we think of as like, wow, she's like blessed with this talent. It's so easy for her. But when you actually hear her story, like it was the opposite of easy. Like she was very, very stubborn, very hardworking, and very aware that she couldn't do it by herself.
If we're to, thank you, if we're to step forward, if we're saying, if we want to tap into the creativity that's inside each and every one of us, I believe is inside each and every one of us, where do we begin? How do we start?
So the biggest thing you can do, I think, is start with consumption. I think that's a really important thing. And then work on your mindset, right? Our mindsets are so scary when it comes to creativity these days, right? Because so many of us, I actually think here's the truth. And I don't say quite this in the book because I think it might be mildly controversial and I don't want it to distract from the message, but I do think that we like these stories of creative genius in part because it gives us a pass. In part because it says, well, it's easy for them and hard for me. I don't actually have to work that hard. I just have to keep hoping I find something that's easy for me one day. And that's BS. It's not easy for anyone. It's just they were young when they started or they had a parent who forced them to do the hard part. And so, yeah, it's good.
Oop. You've frozen up.
That there is a shortcut.
Can you repeat that? You froze up for just 1 second.
Which part should I repeat from?
About 2 sentences ago through something shortcut.
Oh, yeah. 2 sentences ago.
Or you can just, it gives us a pass.
Yeah, okay, I'll start. Yeah. So it gives us a pass to not actually try that hard because we look at it and we say, well, I just have to keep waiting until I find something that's easy for me. It's okay that like, this is hard and I'm going to give up because there will eventually be something easy for me, or I hope there's something easy for me. And the reality is, since it wasn't easy for anyone, right? They just benefited from, maybe they started as a kid and their parents forced them. And this is why video games are so addictive, because unlike the real world, gaining and leveling up in video games is easy in the beginning. In the real world, that's not true. And so I think you have to make that mindset shift and realize that if you do the hard work, if you do deliberate practice, if you engage in the content, eventually you will find creative success and creative leveling up. But you have to do the work and it is not going to be easy.
How was it for you when you started your company in 2012?
Oh my God. I mean, I made so many dumb mistakes. I think, one of the things I did right was I surrounded myself with a lot of really experienced people.
Yep.
One of the things I did wrong is I didn't listen to them that much.
Oh, no.
So they gave me a lot of feedback that was really good and I didn't do a good enough job listening. And so now, one of my pieces of advice to people is, I think especially when you're young and you start a company, you tend to do it because you're sort of a know-it-all, and you have to really quickly shed that identity because people who've been there, done that, have a lot of wisdom that is really, really valuable to any sort of creative process.
I guess it also means that you want to hire people rather than necessarily hiring people who will follow your mold. Be risky and be willing to hire people who may know more than you.
Exactly. It's important to find people who support your weaknesses too, right? It's not about finding lots of people who do all the same things you do. That's not how to be successful. The trick is, how do you take your weaknesses and find other people, other ways, other technology, whatever it is, to fill those gaps.
Thank you. Before we went on air, you had mentioned meditation briefly. What can you tell us about what you've learned about meditation, how that fits in?
So one of the most interesting things is that, how our brains work, right? So our right hemisphere is where we experience these aha moments, and our left hemisphere, where we do all our logical processing, is where we experience much more conscious processing of problems. Mm-hmm. And so the thing is that if you want to experience the aha moments going on in your right hemisphere, your left hemisphere has to shut up. And so one of the things you find is that these creatives, will oftentimes be very specific. It's not necessarily pure meditation. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it is, but some sort of meditation-like activity. Maybe it's running. There's a lot of writers who are famous for being big runners. There's a lot of creatives who talk about how important physical fitness is, and I really think that's code word for they like the silent time, right? Because they like that quiet. Bill Gates famously spends a week every year going to a cabin by himself in the woods, because you need that time literally where your left hemisphere is just not operating, it's not thinking through things, so you actually experience the ideas that are happening right about at the level of consciousness to subconsciousness in your right hemisphere. And so that peace and quiet is actually essential to creativity.
It's I'm a long time, almost lifelong meditator, and I'm a runner. And in fact, we have a program on mindful running. But what's real interesting lately is I've tripped over mountain biking, which I hadn't done in almost 20 years. Did it as a kid. And when I go out exploring on a bicycle, it's as if I'm a kid again, just going around the block and going around the block. and the creative ideas are popping left and right. Something about getting in alignment with the little Michael inside of me.
I love it.
Ideas are flowing.
I love it. It's good. Yeah. And look, your left hemisphere is doing less work. You're enjoying, you're in flow state, and you're benefiting from that. And you actually can experience what's going on in your right hemisphere. You can hear those ahas.
Exactly. So 2 real personal things, if you don't mind me asking. First, who is Jim the Sherpa, and how has he helped you?
So I benefited from, I have an amazing agent, Jim Levine. He's he's older and wiser. I won't say his age because he'd probably get mad at me. But he's amazing. I mean, he's like Ray Dalio's agent, Mark Benioff's agent, Eric Schmidt's agent, and he happens to have also a lot of young authors who he mentors. And so he worked with me for months on the proposal and getting it there. And is a great example of a master teacher that I talk about in the book, where like literally the book would A, not exist without him, and B, it would be so much worse if it did without him, because he gave me so much guidance that exists from, he's been doing it for 25 years, and it's just an amazing, amazing human being.
And Harry, who gave you your first break?
Oh, yeah. So my original investor in my company was a guy, Harry Weller, who unfortunately died in his sleep about 2 years ago at the age of 46. And it was really interesting. He invested in my company 5 years ago. I was 22, and invested millions of dollars in my company, and it's just that I think set a lot of foundations for both my company's success and sort of building up my confidence and sense of self. And so that's just a very amazing thing. And so I dedicated the book to him in sort of appreciation of that.
Where does faith and trust fit in? How did you know at 22 this was going to work for him to put that money in?
I think a lot of times with creativity, you don't have, I think naivety goes a long way. Because I think when there's a lot of stuff you don't know, it's a lot easier, I think, to have faith in yourself. So I think this is why you see a lot of young people in a lot of creative fields, is that you almost don't know better. You don't know that you can fail. And so I think that's actually can be a really healthy and powerful force for good too.
Awesome. So from there, if I took off my coaching hat, if I put it on you today, what one homework assignment would you give people, Allen, to help them start down this creative path?
I think what you should do is find people who you can surround yourself with, who will inspire you, motivate you, and keep you accountable to your creative journey. I think that is the dynamic of creativity that is probably the hardest to replicate as an adult. But if you do that first, I think a lot of other things will start flowing from that.
Awesome. On that note, what advice, this is a question, Jessica, my wife, she's the producer. She always wants me to ask, what advice would you give parents to help cultivate creativity in their kids?
Don't tell your kids that they're good or bad at certain things. Well, tell them they're good at things, but don't tell them they're bad at certain things, because it gets them into their head very early on that their abilities are these fixed assets. And science shows us that's not true. That's usually the result of what we tell children. And so it's very, very important to not make your kids think that they have these fixed skills, right? They're not robots. They can get better at things.
Carol Dweck and the mindset. On that note, what personally brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call the woohoo factor?
I'm a very social creature, and so I love my friends. I have a lot of very kind and sweet and generous friends, and so being around them, I throw a lot of big parties, not because I'm a drunk, but because I like just having a lot of positive energy around me, and that's my happy place, surrounded by people I love. It's
kind of kicking it old school, but did you like the Beastie Boys? I was saying, do you like the Beastie Boys?
Oh, I didn't hear you. No, I don't.
I don't know why I feel called out. We'll strike that one from the record. With that said, any last words of wisdom? This is brilliant. First off, where can people go to find your book, The Creative Curve, and to find out more?
Go to thecreativecurve.com and anywhere books are sold.
One more time. So if you didn't catch thecreativecurve.com and allen.xyz, then come on over to inspirenationshow.com. We'll get you over to thecreativecurve.com and allen.xyz. Any last words of wisdom you want to share with people, Allen?
I am inspired at Inspire Nation.
Woohoo! I'll take that and run with it. For everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get the Creative Curve, and begin boosting your own creativity today and shine bright. Woohoo!
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Alan. This was a lot of fun.
This was really good, man. I had fun, and I'm looking forward to being live.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!